The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which Perdita Blackwood would later reflect was entirely appropriate for a catastrophe. "You're to be married," her father announced, not looking up from his breakfast kipper. "To the Duke of Thornfield. Never met him myself, but the solicitors assure me he's quite wealthy. Scarred in the Crimea, apparently. Face half melted, or some such thing." Perdita's teacup stopped halfway to her lips. "I beg your pardon?" "Scarred. The war, you know. Dreadful business." Her father finally glanced up, his rheumy eyes vague behind thick spectacles. "The wedding is Saturday week. Do try to look pleased, girl. A duke is nothing to sneeze at, even a ruined one." The porcelain cup met the saucer with more force than strictly necessary. Outside the breakfast room window, London's November rain hammered against glass already gray with coal smoke. Perdita's fingers found the ink stain on her sleeve, permanent reminder of last night's work on the Northumberland survey. She'd been awake until 3, correcting the coastal measurements near Bamber, and now her father was correcting her entire life. "I have no intention," she said carefully, each word precise as a compass bearing, "of marrying anyone, least of all a stranger. Not a stranger, a duke, and you'll do as you're told." "I'm 26 years old, father, well past the age of—" "You're 26 and unmarried, which makes you a burden I can no longer afford." He returned to his kipper with the conversation-ending finality of someone who'd never been contradicted by anything more threatening than a miscalculated longitude. "Your brother's debts have seen to that. The Duke has agreed to settle them in exchange for your hand. Generous of him, considering." "Considering what?" The unspoken words hung between them like smoke. Considering she was plain. Considering she was too tall, too angular, too prone to inking her fingers and squinting at meridian lines. Considering she'd rather spend Friday evenings calculating geodetic positions than dancing at Almack's. Considering she'd turned down 2 perfectly adequate proposals because the men in question had called her work charming in that particular tone that meant pointless. Perdita stood, her chair scraping against oak floorboards. "Where?" "Where does this Duke reside? If I'm to be sold like a cartographic instrument, I should at least know the location of my exile." Her father's mustache twitched, the closest he ever came to amusement. "Thornfield Castle, Northumberland, practically Scotland, but not quite. Miles from anywhere civilized. Rather fitting, actually." Northumberland. The word lodged in her chest like a fishhook. She'd been mapping Northumberland's coastline for 8 months, working from old naval surveys and newer trigonometric data. She knew every inlet, every cliff face, every treacherous shoal between Berwick and Newcastle. She knew Thornfield Castle, too, marked it on her charts as a gray stone fortress crouching above the North Sea, surrounded by nothing but windswept moors and the ghosts of border wars. She'd never imagined living there. She'd certainly never imagined being forced to marry its owner, a man whose face was half melted and whose motivations for purchasing a bride were entirely opaque. "I see," she said quietly. "And am I permitted to know why the Duke of Thornfield requires a wife so urgently that he's willing to buy one sight unseen? Does it matter?" "It matters to me." Her father sighed, setting down his fork with the air of a man deeply inconvenienced by female curiosity. The solicitors mentioned an inheritance clause, something about requiring a wife to maintain the estate. You know how these old families are, full of ridiculous stipulations. But the money is real enough, and your brother's creditors are not patient men. So, she was collateral. A signature on a contract, a body to fulfill a legal requirement, a cartographer being forcibly reoriented toward a new prime meridian, whether she wished it or not. "When do I leave?" Her voice emerged steadier than she felt. "Tomorrow, the Duke has sent a carriage. He'll meet you at the castle, Saturday morning, ahead of the ceremony." Her father returned to his breakfast, already dismissing her. "Pack accordingly. I'm told Northumberland is frightfully cold." Perdita spent that evening in her workroom, surrounded by maps. They covered every surface, rolled and stacked, pinned to walls, spread across her drafting table in overlapping layers. The British Isles unfolded around her in ink and mathematics. Coastlines rendered in careful hachures, triangulation points marked with crosses, longitude lines marching westward from Greenwich like bars of a cage. Her current project, the Northumberland Survey, lay half-finished under the lamp. She'd been correcting errors in the original naval charts, updating them with new astronomical observations and improved theodolite measurements. Precise work, important work, work that would be published by the Geographical Society under a man's name, because they didn't accept submissions from women, but work nonetheless. "You're still at it?" Her friend Margaret appeared in the doorway, shawl-wrapped and concerned. "Purdy, you leave tomorrow. Shouldn't you be packing?" "I am packing." Perdita gestured to the trunk in the corner, already filled with drawing instruments, surveying equipment, and entirely impractical amounts of rag paper. "Everything essential." "Dresses, darling. I meant dresses." "Those too, 3 of them." Margaret crossed to the drafting table, her reflection ghosting across the glass lampshade. She was everything Perdita wasn't: petite, soft, conventionally pretty. They'd been friends since the schoolroom, united by Margaret's hatred of embroidery and Perdita's refusal to pretend stupidity. "Tell me you're not bringing your entire cartographic library to your wedding." "Of course not, just the essentials." Perdita dipped her pen, adding a depth sounding off Lindisfarne. "Besides, what else am I supposed to do in Northumberland? From what I hear, the Duke is practically a hermit. No social calls, no visitors, just him and his scars and his moldering castle." "Have you considered," Margaret said carefully, "that this might not be entirely terrible?" The pen stilled. "In what possible universe?" "You'll be in Northumberland, where you've been dying to conduct field research. You'll have access to the entire coastline. You'll be a duchess, Purdy. You can do whatever you like. No one to tell you that cartography isn't suitable for ladies. No father dismissing your work as hobby." "No," Perdita agreed. "Just a husband I've never met who bought me to satisfy an inheritance clause. A husband who lives in isolation and, from what you've said, has no interest in society. He's not going to drag you to dinner parties, is he? He's not going to expect you to host soirees and make small talk. He might just leave you entirely alone." It was a seductive thought, dangerous even. Perdita had spent her entire life being too much, too tall, too clever, too interested in subjects that made men uncomfortable. Her mother had died despairing of her. Her father had given up entirely. Her brother? No, she wouldn't think about Frederick and his gambling debts and the way he'd looked at her last week, calculating as if she were already converted to currency. What if he's cruel? The question emerged smaller than she'd intended. What if he expects things, a real marriage? Margaret's hand found hers. Then you'll handle it the way you handle everything else, with precision and stubbornness and that terrifying intelligence you keep pretending to hide. She squeezed once, hard. Besides, maybe he's decent. Maybe he's as trapped as you are. Men, Perdita said, are never as trapped as women. But she rolled up the Northumberland Survey anyway, securing it with linen tape, and tucked it into her trunk alongside her theodolite and her carefully calibrated compass. If she was going to be exiled to the borderlands, she'd at least make something useful of it. Outside, London's rain continued its assault on the glass, Perdita extinguished the lamp and stood in the darkness, watching water stream down the window in rivulets like tears or rivers or the coastal boundaries she'd spent 8 months perfecting. Tomorrow, she would travel north to marry a scarred stranger in a castle she knew only as a mark on a map. The week after, she would become a duchess. And sometime after that, if she was very lucky, or very clever, or simply very determined, she might become herself again. The journey north took 3 days. Perdita watched England transform outside the carriage window. London's smoke-choked sprawl giving way to open countryside, then rolling hills, then the wild, treeless expanses of Northumberland. The sky grew larger as buildings shrank away. Stone walls divided fields into ancient patterns. Wind bent grass in waves like water. She'd studied this landscape from above, in the abstract language of contour lines and elevation markers. Being inside it was different, raw, stranger, more real. The air smelled of peat and approaching winter. When they stopped to change horses at a posting inn, the locals spoke with accents so thick she had to concentrate to parse the meaning. "You're bound for Thornfield?" the ostler asked, eyeing the ducal crest on the carriage door. His tone suggested this was both impressive and inadvisable. "I am." "Ah," he sucked his teeth. "Well, His Grace keeps to himself, he does. Not that anyone can blame him, after." The man trailed off, making a vague gesture toward his own face. After what, exactly? But the ostler had already turned away, suddenly busy with harness adjustments that didn't require adjusting. It was the same at every stop. Mentions of the Duke produced careful neutrality, averted eyes, that peculiar northern reticence that said more than words. No one spoke ill of him. No one spoke well of him either. He existed in their conversation as a blank space, present but undefined, like unexplored territory on an old map marked "Here be dragons." On the 3rd day, they left the coastal road and struck inland across the moors. Thornfield Castle appeared at sunset, rising from the landscape like an accusation. It was older than Perdita had expected, Norman foundations visible in the lower courses, with medieval additions and a more recent Georgian wing that sat incongruously against the ancient keep. The whole structure crouched on a granite outcrop overlooking the sea, surrounded by moorland that stretched to every horizon. No trees, no shelter, just wind and stone and the distant crash of waves against cliffs she couldn't see, but could hear, that particular percussion of water meeting rock. The carriage climbed the approach road. Perdita's fingers found her compass, an unconscious gesture, checking orientation. The castle faced northeast, positioned to watch both the sea road and the inland approaches. Strategic, defensive, built by people who understood that survival meant constant vigilance. "We're here, miss," the driver called down. "Miss. Not yet, Your Grace." She had until tomorrow morning, until the ceremony, until she signed whatever papers made her officially the property, no, the wife, of a man she'd never seen. The carriage door opened. A housekeeper stood waiting, gray-haired and stern-faced, her keys jangling at her waist like weaponry. "Miss Blackwood, I'm Mrs. Hodge. His Grace extends his regrets that he cannot greet you personally. He's been detained by estate business." The woman's expression suggested this was both true and entirely expected. "Your rooms are prepared. The ceremony will take place tomorrow at 10 o'clock in the chapel. Do you have questions?" Hundreds, starting with why and ending with how do I escape? Where is the Duke now? In the North Tower, his private apartments. He takes his meals there and conducts business from his study. You'll meet him tomorrow morning. Mrs. Hodge gestured toward the entrance. "If you'll follow me." The castle interior was surprisingly warm, fires burning in every grate, though the corridors still carried that particular chill of old stone and sea wind. They climbed stairs and traversed galleries hung with portraits of severe-looking men in ruffs and armor. The women were fewer, painted smaller, their faces uniformly pale and watchful. "The family gallery," Mrs. Hodge noted without stopping. 13 generations of Thornfield dukes. His Grace is the 14th. And his Duchess? Dead these 20 years. Died giving birth to... The housekeeper caught herself. Well, ancient history. But Perdita had been trained to notice blank spaces, the gaps in surveys that indicated missing data. Died giving birth to... someone. The Duke, presumably. Which made his mother a casualty of his existence and explained nothing about why he was now purchasing a replacement bride, like one might order new furniture. Her rooms occupied the South Tower, as far from the Duke's apartments as possible while remaining in the same building. The sitting room overlooked the moors, currently being consumed by dusk, a bedchamber connected through a heavy oak door. Everything was clean, expensive, and profoundly impersonal. "Dinner will be sent up," Mrs. Hodge said. "His Grace thought you might prefer privacy this evening." "How considerate." Perdita's voice came out more acidic than intended. "Does the Duke often make assumptions about his prisoner's preferences?" The housekeeper's expression didn't change, but something flickered behind her eyes. Approval, maybe, or recognition. "I'll have your trunks brought up. Sleep well, Miss Blackwood. Tomorrow is an important day." She left, the door closed. Perdita stood alone in her tower, listening to wind howl around stone corners and feeling very much like a fairy tale princess locked away by someone else's narrative. Except, she walked to the window. The glass was old, wavy, distorting the view into something dreamlike, but she could still make out the coastline, darker line where land met sea, the white flicker of breakers, the lighthouse beam sweeping its arc from somewhere north. Holy Island, probably. Lindisfarne. She'd marked it on her survey 3 months ago, calculating the lighthouse position from triangulated bearings taken from Bamburgh Castle and Berwick Harbor. Her compass still hung at her waist. Her surveying equipment was in the trunks being carried up the tower stairs. And beyond these windows lay hundreds of miles of coastline she'd only ever seen as ink on paper. Margaret had been right. This exile might also be an opportunity, if she could survive the marriage first. Perdita didn't sleep. She sat at the tower window with a blanket around her shoulders, watching stars wheel overhead and trying to remember why she'd once loved cartography. It had started with her grandfather, an East India Company navigator who'd taught her dead reckoning and celestial navigation before she was old enough to understand that girls weren't supposed to learn such things. He'd died when she was 12, but he'd left her his instruments and his books and his conviction that the world made sense if you measured it carefully enough. She'd believed him. She'd spent 14 years believing that precision was a kind of magic, that if she could just chart everything accurately enough, coastlines and rivers and roads and boundaries, then she'd understand how things fit together, how she fit. But you couldn't triangulate your way out of being female, couldn't calculate an azimuth that led away from social expectation. The world's coordinates were fixed long before she was born, and her options had always been limited to the narrow band of acceptable positions: wife, mother, dependent daughter, never cartographer, never herself. Tomorrow she would add Duchess to the list of things she was supposed to be instead of who she actually was. Dawn came slowly, gray light seeping into the tower like water rising. Perdita finally slept for an hour, then woke to find a maid building up the fire and Mrs. Hodge returning with breakfast and a dress. "His Grace thought you might not have brought wedding clothes," the housekeeper said, spreading the gown across the bed. It was gray silk, beautifully made, entirely unsuitable for a November morning in Northumberland. It was his mother's, altered to fit. "How did he know my measurements?" "He didn't, he guessed. His Grace is observant." Perdita touched the silk. It whispered under her fingers, expensive and cold. I haven't agreed to this, you know, the marriage. No, Mrs. Hodge met her eyes directly. But you came. That's agreement enough in the eyes of the law. The law, Perdita said, is not famous for caring what women think. No, the housekeeper agreed. It's not. She helped Perdita dress, stays and petticoats and the gray silk that fit perfectly, which was somehow worse than if it hadn't. Someone had studied her from a distance and calculated her dimensions and ordered alterations, all without her knowledge. She was already being measured, mapped, possessed. At 9:45, Mrs. Hodge led her down through the castle to the chapel. It was small, medieval, lit by narrow windows that let in slices of northern light. The stone walls were bare except for a few memorial plaques. No flowers, no guests. Just a nervous vicar clutching his prayer book and, at the front of the chapel, a man. He stood with his back to the door, tall, taller than she'd expected. Broad-shouldered under a black coat, dark hair curling against his collar. He didn't turn as they entered. Perdita's heart hammered. This was it then. The moment she'd see the scars, the melted face, the war damage that had turned a duke into a hermit and a hermit into a buyer of reluctant brides. She walked down the short aisle. Her footsteps echoed. The man still didn't turn. "Your Grace," Mrs. Hodge said quietly, "Miss Blackwood is here." Finally, he moved. Slowly, as if the motion cost him something, turned to face her. And Perdita forgot how to breathe. Because there were no scars, no melted flesh, no war damage at all. The Duke of Thornfield was beautiful. Not conventionally handsome, his features were too sharp for that, too intense. But beautiful in the way cliffs were beautiful, or storms, or dangerous places that drew you forward despite better judgment. Dark eyes under darker brows, a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile, cheekbones that could cut glass, and skin, perfect, unmarked, not a scar to be seen. "Miss Blackwood." His voice was low, rough-edged, like he didn't use it often. "Thank you for coming." She stared at him, then at Mrs. Hodge, then back to the Duke, whose perfect, unscarred face was watching her with an expression she couldn't parse. "I was told," Perdita said slowly, "that you were scarred in the Crimea, that your face was half melted, that you were—" She stopped. Ruined, monstrous, unmarriageable. "Yes," the Duke said. "You were told that." He paused. "Would you have come if you'd known the truth?" "What truth? That you're a liar?" Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or pain. "That I'm illegitimate, the child of a stable boy and a duchess who died rather than face the scandal. My father, the man who raised me as his heir, hated me for it. When he died 5 years ago, the title should have passed to a distant cousin, but he'd made a stipulation in his will. I could inherit if I married before my 35th birthday. He assumed I'd never find someone willing. Most women, you see, want a husband who's actually legitimate." The words landed like stones in water, sinking fast. Perdita's mind raced through implications. So the scars? A lie the solicitors told to explain why I was willing to marry a stranger. They thought it would be more palatable than the truth. His jaw tightened. "I told them not to. I wanted you to know what you were agreeing to. But they convinced me that no one would come if they knew a bastard was buying a bride." "And yet," Perdita said, "here we are. You've deceived me. Your solicitors have lied to my father. And I'm supposed to, what? Be grateful you're pretty?" "No." He looked directly at her, and the intensity in his eyes was like standing too close to fire. "You're supposed to make a choice. The real choice I should have given you from the start." He produced a folded document from his coat, held it out. "This is a contract. If you marry me this morning, you'll be legally the Duchess of Thornfield. The title will be secured, my inheritance maintained, your brother's debts settled. You'll live here. I'll live here. We need never speak to each other again if you prefer. Or," he paused, "or you can walk away. I'll pay for your passage back to London. I'll settle your brother's debts anyway. The only consequence will be that I lose Thornfield. But that's my problem, not yours." Perdita took the contract, read it. It was exactly what he'd said, generous to the point of absurdity, requiring nothing of her except her name on the marriage register and her physical presence at the castle for at least 6 months of every year. Everything else was optional. Children, intimacy, even conversation. "Why would you offer this?" She looked up from the paper. "If I leave, you lose everything." "Because," he said quietly, "I've been lied to about my worth my entire life. I won't do the same to you." The chapel was silent except for wind against ancient glass. The vicar shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Hodge stood like a statue by the door. And Perdita stood, holding a contract that offered her everything she'd ever wanted. Freedom, independence, access to the Northumberland coast for research, in exchange for 6 months a year in a castle with a man who was either remarkably honest or dangerously clever. Truth versus appearance, trust versus betrayal. The two themes she'd been assigned by fate or randomization, or her own traitorous heart that was currently insisting the Duke of Thornfield's eyes held something genuine, something raw, something she recognized because she'd felt it herself, every time someone called her cartography charming. She thought about Margaret's words, about the maps waiting in her trunk, about spending the rest of her life measuring coastlines from London while her brother gambled away money she didn't have, and her father sighed over his disappointment in her existence. She thought about the alternative. 6 months a year in this wind-swept castle with a beautiful, illegitimate duke who just handed her the weapon of his vulnerability and told her to use it however she wished. It wasn't really a choice at all. "I have conditions," Perdita said. The duke's eyebrows rose. "Name them." "I want access to your library, your maps, and any surveying equipment you might have. I want permission to conduct cartographic research along the coast. I want my own workroom with proper lighting and drafting facilities, and," she paused, "and I want honesty. No more lies. Not from you, not from anyone in your employ. If I'm going to be trapped here, I'd rather be trapped by truth than comfortable deception." He considered her, then extended his hand. "Done. Though for what it's worth, Miss Blackwood, I don't think you're trapped. I think you're calculating whether this prison has better walls than the one you left." His palm was warm, calloused. She shook once, firmly, the way her grandfather had taught her. "Grip like you mean it." "Then let's find out," Perdita said. "Shall we, Your Grace?" "Tobias," he corrected. "If we're to be honest with each other, you should at least know my name." "Perdita. Perdita." He tested the word, rolled it carefully off his tongue like a bearing taken with an unfamiliar instrument. "It means lost." "I know what it means." "Are you lost?" She looked at him, this beautiful, illegitimate, impossible man who'd offered her a choice when he could have simply taken what he'd paid for. "No," she said finally, "but I'm about to be found." And they walked together to the altar, where the vicar was already fumbling with his prayer book, and the ceremony that would make her a duchess began with words she barely heard because she was too busy noticing that Tobias's hands were shaking, just slightly, and that he kept his eyes closed during the vows, as if he were afraid of what he might see if he opened them, and that when he finally slipped the ring onto her finger, it fit perfectly, like someone had measured her from a distance and made sure everything would align. Marriage, it turned out, was mostly breakfast. Perdita discovered this on her third morning as the Duchess of Thornfield, when she finally abandoned the pretense of taking meals in her tower and ventured down to the dining room. Tobias was already there, half hidden behind the Times and a fortress of toast. "Good morning," she said, because someone had to start somewhere. The newspaper lowered. "Good morning. Tea?" "Please." He poured. They sat in silence, punctuated by china clinks and the distant howl of wind around the North Tower. This, apparently, was marriage to a duke who'd promised they need never speak. Breakfast, tea, newspapers, and the companionable quiet of two people who'd agreed not to expect anything from each other. It should have been awful. Instead, it was oddly restful. "Mrs. Hodge mentioned you wanted a workroom," Tobias said eventually. "The east parlor has the best light. I've had it cleared. Your equipment has been unpacked." Perdita looked up. "That was efficient. I told you I'd keep my end of the bargain." He returned to his newspaper. "There's also a complete set of ordnance survey maps in the library, first editions if you're interested. And I've written to the Royal Geographical Society requesting their latest coastal publications." "You've been busy." "I'm not very good at being married," Tobias said from behind the Times. "But I can manage logistics." Something warm unfurled in Perdita's chest, something dangerous that felt like gratitude or recognition, or the beginning of an error in judgment. "Thank you, truly." "You're welcome, truly." The newspaper rose again. Perdita attacked her toast and tried not to notice that her husband, God, her husband, took his tea black, ate methodically through 3 pieces of toast with mathematical precision, and had ink stains on his right thumb that suggested he'd been writing before dawn. "What were you working on?" The question escaped before she could stop it. The newspaper lowered again. Tobias regarded her with those dark, unreadable eyes. "Estate accounts. Why?" "Your thumb, ink-stained. I wondered." He glanced down at his hand, then back at her, and something shifted in his expression. Recognition, maybe, that she'd noticed what others missed. "You're observant." "It's my job. Was my job. I don't know what it is now." "Still your job," Tobias said quietly. "Being a duchess doesn't unmake you, Perdita. It's just additional coordinates." The warmth in her chest grew teeth. This man, this impossible, complicated man, kept saying exactly the right thing in exactly the wrong circumstances. It would be so much easier if he were cruel or stupid or anything other than surprisingly thoughtful. "I'm going to survey the coastline today," she announced, mostly to remind herself why she'd agreed to this arrangement. "Between here and Bamburgh, I need to verify some depth soundings. Take Matthews, he knows the cliff paths." Tobias stood, folding his newspaper with military precision. "And Perdita, be careful. The rocks are treacherous, and the tide comes in faster than you'd think. I'm a cartographer. I know how to read tidal charts." "I'm sure you do." He paused at the door. "But knowing something and experiencing it are different things. Ask anyone who thought they understood war from looking at maps." He left. Perdita sat alone with her cooling tea and the uncomfortable realization that her husband had just compared her work to his trauma, and she had no idea what to do with that information, except add it to the growing collection of things she didn't understand about Tobias, Duke of Thornfield. The Northumberland coast was nothing like its representation on paper. Perdita had drawn these cliffs 100 times, measured their heights, calculated their positions, marked them with precise hatchers that indicated slope and elevation. But ink couldn't capture the way wind screamed up from the sea, or how black basalt broke through gray limestone in layers that spoke of ancient violence, or the particular terror of standing at a cliff edge with nothing between you and a 100-foot drop, except your own balance and faith in trigonometry. Matthews, the dour groundskeeper Tobias had assigned as her guide, stood at a safe distance and watched her set up her theodolite with the air of a man expecting disaster. "Tide's turning," he observed. "I know, I have an hour. His Grace won't be pleased if ye fall." "His Grace," Perdita said, squinting through the telescope, "will never know unless you tell him." "Oh, I'll tell him," Matthews sucked his teeth. "If ye survive to make it worth tellin'." She ignored him, focusing on the lighthouse. Lindisfarne sat 3 miles north, its tower stark white against gray sea and grayer sky. She needed 2 more angle measurements to triangulate its exact position. Then she could compare her calculations to the Admiralty charts and see how badly the Royal Navy had botched their observations. Your Grace, the water." Perdita glanced down. Foam swirled around the base of their rock outcrop, closer than it had been 5 minutes ago. The tide was indeed turning, and turning fast. "One more reading," she muttered, adjusting the theodolite. The crosshairs found the lighthouse. She read the angle, noted it in her field book, and— "Your Grace!" Matthews grabbed her arm. "Now!" The wave hit as she was packing the instrument. Cold North Sea water exploded up the cliff face, drenching them both and nearly sweeping the theodolite from her hands. Matthews hauled her backward with surprising strength for a man of 60-odd years. They scrambled up the path to safety. Perdita's skirts were soaked, her boots squelching, her hair escaping its pins in stringy tendrils. The theodolite was wet but intact. Her field book was ruined. "Damnation," she said. "Aye," Matthews wrung out his cap. "That's one word for it." They walked back to the castle in sodden silence. The wind cut through wet wool like knives. By the time they reached the courtyard, Perdita was shivering so violently her teeth chattered. Tobias was waiting in the entrance hall. "You're wet," he observed. "Brilliant deduction." Perdita tried to brush past him. "If you'll excuse me." "What happened?" "Nothing. The tide. I miscalculated." His hand caught her elbow, gentle but firm. "You're shaking." "I'm fine." "You're freezing." He looked past her to Matthews. "Hot water to her rooms, now, and brandy." "Really not necessary." "Perdita." Tobias's voice dropped into a register that suggested he'd given orders to men under fire and expected obedience. "You can argue with me after you're dry and warm. Until then, you'll do exactly what I say. Understood?" She should have bristled. Should have told him he had no right to give her orders. But the truth was, she couldn't feel her fingers anymore, and her vision was starting to blur around the edges. And standing in this entrance hall, arguing with a duke who looked genuinely concerned, seemed suddenly exhausting. "Fine," she whispered. "Good." He steered her toward the stairs, one hand at her elbow. "Can you manage the steps?" "I'm wet, not dying." "Humor me." They climbed to her tower. Tobias deposited her in a chair by the fire, which someone had already built up to a roar. Mrs. Hodge appeared with blankets. A maid followed with hot water. Tobias himself poured brandy into a glass and pressed it into her hands. "Drink." She drank. The liquor burned down her throat, spreading warmth through her chest. Sensation returned to her extremities in painful prickles. "Thank you," she managed. "Don't thank me. Be more careful." Tobias crouched beside her chair, eye level now, his face stripped of its usual careful neutrality. "I meant what I said about the tide. These waters have killed people who knew them far better than you do. I had it under control." "No. You had an hour's calculation that didn't account for wind direction or unusually strong currents or 100 other variables that exist outside your measurements." His intensity was like heat from the fire. "You're brilliant, Perdita, but brilliance doesn't stop you from drowning." The words landed with the force of truth. She'd been so focused on proving she could do this, chart the coast, conduct real fieldwork, that she'd forgotten the difference between theory and practice. Maps were safe, tidy. The world they represented was neither. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. Tobias's expression softened. "I don't want your apology. I want you alive." "Why?" "Because you're my wife." He said it simply, like that explained everything. "Because you're here. Because—" He stopped, shook his head. "Get warm, dry off. Mrs. Hodge will bring dinner to your rooms." He stood. Perdita caught his hand before he could leave, an impulse she didn't examine too closely. "Tobias, were you really in the Crimea?" His whole body went still. "Yes." "What happened?" For a long moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "I learned that maps lie. They show terrain, positions, troop movements. What they don't show is mud or disease or how many men die from cold instead of bullets." He looked down at their joined hands. "They don't show that some scars are invisible." He pulled free, gently, left her sitting by the fire with brandy warming her hands and the uncomfortable knowledge that her husband was as damaged as she'd been told, just not in any way that showed on his perfect, illegitimate face. Perdita spent the next week working in her new parlor. The room was everything Tobias had promised, east-facing, flooded with morning light, equipped with a proper drafting table and storage for her instruments. She spread out her Northumberland survey and began the meticulous work of correcting it with field observations, transferring angle measurements and depth soundings from her, mostly, intact notes. It should have been absorbing. It was her favorite kind of work, precise, methodical, transforming observation into representation. But she kept getting distracted by footsteps in the corridor, by Tobias passing her door at odd hours, never stopping, just that distinctive tread of boots on stone, by the awareness that somewhere in this castle her husband was doing, what? Estate business? Brooding in his tower? Remembering Crimean mud and invisible scars? On Thursday, she gave up pretending to work and went looking for him. The North Tower was exactly as forbidding as expected. She climbed the circular stair, knocked on a heavy oak door, and waited. "Come," Tobias's voice, muffled. She entered. The room was a study, walls lined with books, desk buried under papers, fire burning low, and on every available surface, maps. Old maps, military maps, topographical surveys, admiralty charts, a massive ordnance map of the Crimean Peninsula spread across a drafting table that matched hers exactly. Tobias sat at the desk, pen frozen mid-sentence. "Perdita, is something wrong?" No, I just—" She gestured helplessly at the maps. "You never mentioned you were a cartographer." "I'm not. I was an intelligence officer. Maps were tools, not passion." He set down his pen, studying her. "Why are you here?" "Because I'm going mad in my parlor drawing coastlines, while you're locked up here doing God knows what, and we're married, but we might as well be strangers, and I thought—" She stopped. "I don't know what I thought." Tobias leaned back in his chair. "You thought we should try talking to each other." "Yes, maybe. Is that stupid?" "No." He stood, crossed to the Crimean map, traced a line inland from Sevastopol with one finger. "Do you know what the worst part of war is? Tell me. The lies maps tell you." His finger stopped at a marked position. "This shows our supply lines. Clean, clear, impossible to misread. What it doesn't show is that the road was actually a mudslick that swallowed wagons, or that the river marked here had changed course and was a mile east, or that 300 men died because someone in London drew a line on paper and assumed reality would cooperate." Perdita moved closer. The map was annotated in Tobias's handwriting, Corrections, notes, coordinates recalculated. You fixed them. After the fact, after men were already dead. He looked at her, and the grief in his eyes was like looking into deep water. You asked why I care if you're careful with the tide. That's why. Because I've seen what happens when people trust measurements more than reality. I'm sorry, she said, for what you saw, for what the maps cost you. Don't apologize for doing what I did. We're the same, you and I. We both try to make sense of chaos by measuring it. He smiled, bitter and small. The difference is, your maps create knowledge, mine created corpses. Without thinking, Perdita reached for his hand. His fingers closed around hers, tight, desperate, like a drowning man grabbing a rope. You can't blame yourself for bad information, she said. Can't I? I was the intelligence officer. My job was to know. He squeezed once, then let go, turning away. But that's not why you came up here. You wanted conversation, not my war history. Actually, Perdita said slowly, I came up here because I've been married to you for a week, and I don't know anything about you except that you're illegitimate, you survived the Crimea, and you drink your tea black. That seems insufficient. What would be sufficient? I don't know. Your favorite color? Your birthday? Whether you prefer Byron or Wordsworth? If you have friends, hobbies, dreams that don't involve estate accounts? She paused. If you regret marrying me. Tobias turned back to face her. Dark blue, December 19th. Neither. I prefer Scott. No friends to speak of. I breed horses, badly. And no. No what? No, I don't regret marrying you. He said it quietly, certainly. You're the most interesting thing that's happened to me since I inherited this mausoleum. I'm a cartographer who nearly drowned taking depth soundings. Exactly. Interesting. The corner of his mouth twitched, not quite a smile, but close. What about you? Do you regret this? Perdita considered. A week ago, she'd been resigned to spinsterhood in London, drawing maps that would be published under false names while her father sighed and her brother gambled and the world slowly calcified around her. Now she was a duchess in Northumberland, married to a beautiful disaster of a man who understood that maps both revealed and concealed truth. No, she said. Not yet. Not yet, Tobias echoed. I'll take that. They stood in his tower study, surrounded by maps of wars and coasts and places neither had been, and something shifted between them. Not attraction precisely, though that was there too, unavoidable as tide. More like recognition. The sense that they were both refugees from different battles, trying to chart new territory with instruments that might not be adequate to the task. Would you like to see the horses? Tobias asked abruptly. You said you wanted to know about me. The stables are where I make sense. I'd like that. They went down together, out across the courtyard to the stables that smelled of hay and leather and animal warmth. Tobias introduced her to each horse by name, recited bloodlines and temperaments and which ones bit. He was more animated here than she'd ever seen him, hands gentle on velvet noses, voice soft with the animals in a way it never was with humans. This is Artemis, he said, stroking a gray mare's neck. She's supposed to be for riding, but she's better at judging character. If she likes you, you're trustworthy. And if she doesn't, then you're my half-brother, and she'll try to bite you. He glanced at Perdita. Hold out your hand. She did. The mare snuffled at her palm, then butted her head against Perdita's shoulder. Gentle, accepting. Well, Tobias said softly, that's settled. What is? You're trustworthy. He smiled, a real smile this time, transforming his face into something unguarded and almost young. Artemis is never wrong. And standing in the stable with straw dusting her skirts and a horse's warm breath on her neck, and Tobias looking at her like she'd passed some test she hadn't known she was taking, Perdita thought, I'm in trouble, because this wasn't supposed to happen. They'd agreed to be strangers sharing a castle, polite, distant, unmessy. But somewhere between breakfast and brandy and maps that lied about supply lines, they'd started becoming something else, something infinitely more dangerous than strangers, something that might require remapping everything she thought she knew about where she stood. December arrived with snow. It fell thick and constant, blanketing the moors and turning the castle into an island marooned in white. Perdita watched from her parlor window as the landscape disappeared under weather, all her carefully charted landmarks erased by the storm. The lighthouse vanished. The cliffs became suggestions. Even the sea was invisible beyond curtains of snow that reduced the world to hypothesis. We're snowed in, Mrs. Hodge announced, bringing afternoon tea. Roads impassable, won't clear for days. Are we adequately supplied? Oh, aye. His Grace always prepares for winter. We could last a month if needed. The housekeeper set down the tray with a meaningful thunk. Just you and him and the staff. Very cozy. There was something in her tone, approval or matchmaking, or simply observation of the obvious. Perdita ignored it, returning to her survey. But the numbers wouldn't cooperate. She kept thinking about Tobias in his tower, looking out at the same white nothing, wondering if he felt as disoriented by the blankness as she did. The truth was, the past 3 weeks had developed a rhythm. Breakfast together most mornings. Occasional dinners in the small dining room, accompanied by conversation that had evolved from weather to books to politics to estate management. Long afternoons in separate rooms, Perdita drawing coastlines while Tobias managed his horses and accounts and whatever else dukes did. Evenings in the library sometimes, reading in companionable silence by the fire. It wasn't intimacy, but it wasn't strangers either. And now the snow had locked them in together, eliminating even the pretense of separate lives. Perdita abandoned her work and went looking for her husband. She found him in the library, standing at the window with a book forgotten in his hand. He didn't turn when she entered, just kept staring out at white nothing. Tobias? Are you all right? Fine. His voice was flat, absent. Just watching it snow. She moved closer. His reflection ghosted in the window glass. Dark eyes, set jaw, tension radiating from his shoulders like heat. Not fine then, not even close. What's wrong? Nothing. Everything. This weather. He stopped, shook his head. Forget it. Tell me. He finally looked at her. The Crimea, winter of '54. We were besieging Sevastopol, and the weather turned. Snow like this, wind worse. No supplies getting through because someone in London looked at a map and thought the roads would hold. His knuckles whitened on the book. Men froze to death in their tents. Horses died standing up. And all I could do was watch it snow and count how many we were losing every hour. Perdita's throat tightened. I'm sorry. You keep apologizing for things that aren't your fault. Someone should. If the army won't, if the map makers won't, then someone should acknowledge that what happened to you was wrong. Tobias set down the book with careful precision. Do you know why I agreed to that inheritance clause? Why I was willing to marry a stranger just to keep this estate? Tell me. Because 30 soldiers survived that winter because of me. I found a supply route the maps said didn't exist, a local shepherd's path over the mountains. I got food and blankets through. 30 men lived who should have died. He met her eyes. This estate generates income. Income supports veterans. The hospital in Newcastle, the soldiers' home in Edinburgh. If I lose Thornfield, I lose the money to keep helping them. So yes, I bought a bride. Because 30 men's lives taught me that survival sometimes requires compromise. The confession hung between them like the snow outside, obscuring, revealing, transforming the landscape of what she thought she understood. The horses, Perdita said slowly. You breed them for therapy, for soldiers. How did you... You mentioned Matthews's son last week, said the mayor helped him readjust after India. And there was that letter from Edinburgh about a new program. She stepped closer. You're not just managing an estate, Tobias. You're running a private war recovery operation. Someone has to. The government certainly isn't. And the illegitimacy? Your father hating you? That's why you care so much. Because if you're not legitimate, you can't help them. Yes. The word came out raw. My father spent his life trying to unmake me, telling me I was worthless, a stain on the family honor, not really his son. The Crimea taught me he was wrong. Not about my birth, that's fact, but about my worth. Those 30 soldiers didn't care whose bastard I was. They just cared that I found them food. Perdita understood then, with the sudden clarity of a perfect triangulation. Tobias hadn't married her to keep an estate. He'd married her to keep a purpose, to maintain the mathematical proof that his existence mattered, that illegitimacy didn't erase value, that the son of a stable boy could still save lives. And she'd agreed to it because she'd wanted the same thing, proof that being an unmarriageable blue-stocking cartographer who cared more about meridians than marriage didn't make her worthless. They'd both been trying to measure their way into significance. I won't let you lose this, she said quietly. Whatever it takes. We'll make the marriage legitimate in the eyes of the law. 6 months a year here, I'll do it. More if necessary. Tobias studied her. Snow fell outside, muffling the world. You'd do that? Trap yourself here permanently? I'm not trapped. You gave me a workroom, access to the coast, freedom to pursue my research. That's more than London ever offered. She paused. Besides, you're not as terrible as I expected. High praise. I mean it. You're... She searched for the right words. You're like a well-made map. Complex, layered, worth studying. Something shifted in his expression. Surprise giving way to something warmer, more vulnerable. Perdita Blackwood, did you just compare your husband to cartography? It's the highest compliment I know. Then I'm honored. He moved closer, slowly, like approaching a skittish horse. May I tell you something? Always. You're the first person who's ever looked at me and seen anything except my father's mistake. You see, he paused, struggling. You see me, Tobias. Not the bastard, not the duke, not the damaged soldier. Just me. That's because, Perdita said, I've spent my whole life being looked at as the wrong thing. Too tall, too clever, too interested in men's work. I know what it's like to be reduced to other people's disappointment. She reached for his hand. So yes, I see you, because you're the first person who's ever seen me too. His fingers twined with hers, warm, calloused, real. They stood like that, connected by the simple geometry of hands holding in a library, while winter erased the world outside. We should probably kiss now, Tobias said. In novels, this is where the protagonists kiss. Is that what we are? Protagonists? I think we might be. He raised his free hand, traced the line of her jaw with his thumb. May I? Yes, Perdita whispered. Please, yes. He kissed her like a man who'd forgotten how, tentative at first, questioning. But she leaned into him, rose on her toes, and kissed him back like she was conducting field research on desire. And tentative became certain, became desperate. His arms came around her. She fisted her hands in his coat. The book he'd been holding fell to the floor with a sound like thunder. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Tobias rested his forehead against hers. "Well," he said, "that's complicated things." We had an agreement, no expectations." "We did." Perdita pulled back enough to meet his eyes. "But I'm a cartographer. When the field observations don't match the original survey, you redraw the map." "So we're what? Remapping our marriage?" "If you want to. I do. Want to." She was babbling, flustered, utterly unlike herself. "I mean, I'd like to try. Being actually married. If you would." Tobias smiled, that rare, unguarded smile that transformed him. "I would very much like that. Though I should warn you, I'm terrible at being married. We'll learn together. I'm excellent at research." "I don't doubt it." He kissed her again, softer this time. "Thorough. Though I suspect this particular subject may require extensive field observation. A cartographer's work is never done." They laughed against each other's mouths, and outside the snow continued falling, and somewhere in the castle Mrs. Hodge was probably smirking into her tea, and Perdita thought, "This is it. This is the moment I've been charting toward my whole life and didn't know it. Not marriage as prison, not compromise as defeat, but partnership as cartography. Two people measuring the same territory from different angles, comparing observations, correcting each other's errors, creating something more accurate than either could manage alone." "Stay tonight," Tobias said. Just stay. In my rooms. I don't want to be alone with the snow and the memories." "Yes." They went up to his tower together, sat by the fire sharing whiskey and talking, really talking, about childhoods and dreams and fears that neither had voiced before. Perdita told him about her grandfather and the East India Company, and learning to calculate longitude while other girls learned embroidery. Tobias told her about growing up as the bastard in a duke's household, never quite legitimate, never quite rejected, always aware he was one death away from losing everything. Sometime near midnight, they fell asleep in the same chair, Perdita curled in Tobias's lap, his arms around her, both of them finally warm enough and safe enough to rest. The snow fell, the castle creaked, and two people who'd started as a commercial transaction slowly became something neither had anticipated. Actual partners in an actual marriage that might, with enough care and observation, chart a course towards something like love. They found the map by accident. It was early January, the snow finally melted, and Perdita was exploring the castle library's geography section. Tobias had mentioned a first edition set of ordnance surveys, and she was determined to catalog them properly. She pulled a volume from the shelf, and behind it, a gap. Not natural space, but a deliberate hollow. She reached in. Her fingers found oilcloth. She pulled out a package, carefully wrapped, sealed with wax bearing the Thornfield crest. "Tobias?" she called. He appeared moments later. They'd developed that habit, responding instantly to each other's voices. "What is it?" "I think it's a map, hidden in the geography section." She showed him the seal. "That's your family crest." His expression went very still. "My father's seal, from before he died." He took the package, turned it over. "I never knew this was here. Should we open it?" "It's hidden for a reason. Either something valuable or something dangerous." He met her eyes. "Your choice. This is your library too now." Perdita thought of all the secrets she'd uncovered in surveys. Unmarked graves, property disputes, smuggling routes revealed by careful observation. Maps always told stories their makers tried to conceal. "Open it," she said. Tobias broke the seal. Inside, a hand-drawn map of the Thornfield estate, beautifully rendered, dating from roughly 30 years ago based on the paper and ink. But it was what the map showed that made them both freeze. A tunnel, starting from the castle cellars, running underground for nearly a mile, emerging at a small stone structure marked Chapel of St. Cuthbert near the coast. "There's a tunnel under the castle?" Perdita leaned closer. "Did you know?" "No, I've been over every inch of this estate. There's no tunnel." Tobias traced the drawn route. Unless it was sealed, hidden." She studied the map. "Why would your father hide this? What's at the chapel?" "I don't know. It's abandoned, mostly ruins. I ride past it sometimes." He looked at her, and she recognized the expression. The same hunger for truth that drove her to verify every survey, to never accept assumptions. "We should go look." "Now? Can you think of a reason not to?" Perdita grinned. "Not a single one." They went down to the cellars, vast stone vaults that stored wine and coal and forgotten furniture. Following the map's directions, they searched the north wall until Perdita's compass began behaving strangely, the needle swinging wildly. "There," she pointed to a section of wall. "Iron behind the stone, lots of it." Tobias examined the stones, found one that moved slightly when pressed. A grinding sound, and a section of wall swung inward, revealing darkness and old stone steps descending. "Well," he said, "apparently there is a tunnel." They fetched lanterns and descended. The tunnel was Norman construction, ancient stone arches, narrow passage, air that tasted of centuries. Their footsteps echoed. Perdita's compass continued its wild spinning, useless in the iron-reinforced passage. She relied on Tobias's steady presence ahead of her, the lantern light catching in his dark hair. They walked for what felt like miles but was probably less, distance dilated underground, stretched by darkness and anticipation. Finally, steps rising. A door. Beyond it, the interior of the ruined chapel, surprisingly intact for a building supposedly abandoned. And in the center of the chapel, a box. Iron-bound oak, locked, covered in dust but clearly protected from weather. Tobias set down his lantern and knelt beside it. "Do we open it?" "Tobias, this belonged to your father. It's your inheritance." "Our inheritance," he corrected. "You're the Duchess. Whatever this is, it's as much yours as mine." He forced the lock. Inside the box, documents, letters, and a second map, this one of the estate's boundaries, showing a strip of coastal land marked Disputed Territory. Perdita lifted the map carefully. "What is this?" Tobias was reading a letter, his face gone white. "It's proof. My father. God." He looked up at her. "My legitimacy. He had proof I was actually his son, not the stable boy's. Medical evidence, witness statements, everything. He knew the whole time." The words dropped like stones. Perdita's mind raced through implications. "Then why?" "Because he hated my mother. She'd had an affair earlier, and he assumed I was the result. But this," Tobias gestured at the documents, "this proves he was wrong. I'm legitimate. I was always legitimate. He just chose to believe otherwise." Perdita knelt beside him, reading over his shoulder. The documents were damning. Physician's report confirming conception dates that could only align with the Duke, not the stable boy. Witness statements from servants, even a letter from the stable boy himself, swearing he'd never touched the Duchess. "He hid this," Tobias said numbly. "Made me believe I was worthless. Made everyone believe it. And all the time, he had proof I was exactly what I was supposed to be." "Why?" Perdita's anger was cold, cartographic, the rage of discovering someone had deliberately falsified a survey. Why would he do that? "Control, cruelty, take your pick." Tobias's hands shook. "He wanted me grateful, dependent. If I believed I was a bastard, I'd never challenge him, never demand my birthright, never question his authority. I'd be forever in his debt just for acknowledging me at all. That's monstrous. That was my father. They sat in silence, surrounded by proof of decades of gaslighting and abuse. The map lay between them. The disputed territory, Perdita realized, was the coastal strip where she'd been conducting her surveys, the land her research had been documenting. There's more, she said quietly, pointing to annotations on the estate map. This disputed territory, your father was claiming it wasn't part of Thornfield, but according to this original survey, she traced the boundary. It is. He was trying to give it away, or sell it, something that required pretending it wasn't part of the estate. Tobias studied the map. To whom? I don't know, but... She pulled out her own survey from her bag, always carried it, habit of a cartographer. Look, I've been documenting this area. There are ruins here, here, and here. Old fortifications. And this section, she pointed to a cove, perfect natural harbor, hidden from the main coast. During the Napoleonic Wars, this would have been ideal for smuggling. You think my father was involved in smuggling? I think someone wanted this land for smuggling, and your father was willing to help them get it. She met his eyes, maybe in exchange for keeping quiet about your legitimacy. Maybe that was the real bargain. The pieces aligned like a perfect triangulation. The hidden documents, the falsified inheritance, the disputed territory. Someone had been blackmailing the old duke, threatening to reveal that his bastard son wasn't actually a bastard, that all his cruelty was built on lies. In exchange for silence, the duke had agreed to disclaim part of the estate. But he died before completing the transaction, and Tobias had inherited everything, never knowing he was actually legitimate or that someone was still waiting to collect their coastal smuggling operation. We need to find out who, Perdita said. Who was your father working with? And why they haven't come forward since his death? Maybe they're still planning to. Maybe that's why... She stopped, pieces clicking together. Maybe that's why someone's been on the estate. Matthews mentioned lights in the old chapel. Sounds at night. We thought it was ghosts or local legends, but it's someone still using the smuggling route. Tobias stood abruptly. We need to go. Now. If they're here. The tunnel door slammed open. A man stood backlit by daylight from the chapel entrance, tall, well-dressed, holding a pistol with the casual competence of someone who knew how to use it. Your Grace, he said pleasantly. And the new Duchess. How unexpected. Tobias moved in front of Perdita instinctively. Who are you? Baron Ashcroft. I had business with your father, unfinished business. He gestured with the pistol. I'd prefer not to shoot a duke, but I will if necessary. Step away from the documents. No. Tobias's voice was flat, certain. Whatever arrangement you had with my father died with him. I don't think so. You see, I've spent 5 years waiting to claim that coastal land. Your father promised it to me. Payment for certain services rendered during the war. Information about troop movements, supply routes, that sort of thing. Ashcroft smiled. He was quite helpful to the Russians, actually. For a price. Treason. The word hung unspoken but obvious. The old duke hadn't just been cruel, he'd been a traitor, selling intelligence that had cost British lives, possibly including lives Tobias had tried to save. You can't prove that, Perdita said, mind racing. Keep him talking, buy time. Oh, but I can. I have letters, contracts, all carefully preserved. If they come to light, the Thornfield name will be destroyed. The estate seized. His Grace will lose everything. Titles, lands, those charming veterans programs. Ashcroft's smile widened. Unless, of course, you give me the coastal strip. Quietly transfer the deeds. I disappear. The letters stay hidden. Everyone survives intact. And if we refuse? Tobias asked. Then I shoot you both, retrieve my documents, and claim the land anyway. Your deaths would be tragic accidents. Smugglers, perhaps. The coast is dangerous. He raised the pistol. Your choice, Your Grace. Legacy or corpses? Perdita's hand found Tobias's, squeezed once, and in that touch communicated, "Trust me." "The documents aren't here," she said. Ashcroft's eyes narrowed. "You're holding them." "These?" She lifted the papers. "These prove the Duke's legitimacy. They're worthless to you. The treason papers, those are still hidden. In the castle, in a location only I know. Lying won't save you. I'm a cartographer. I've surveyed every inch of this estate. Found things in the archives even the Duke didn't know existed." She met Ashcroft's eyes steadily. Hidden rooms, false walls, places where someone might conceal evidence of treason for safekeeping. It was complete fabrication, but her voice held the certainty of someone stating precise coordinates. Ashcroft hesitated. "Where?" "The North Tower, behind a false panel in the study." She paused. "But it's trapped. My husband nearly triggered it last week. You'd need someone who knows the mechanism to open it safely." "Then you'll show me." "No." Tobias's voice was deadly calm. "I will, but you leave my wife here. She tells you the location, I open the panel. She stays safe, or the deal is void." Ashcroft considered. "Your wife remains here, under guard." He gestured with the pistol. "But if you try anything, Your Grace, I'll know, and she'll pay the price." They negotiated details with the strange formality of people conducting business at gunpoint. Finally, Ashcroft agreed. He had associates. 2 men emerged from shadows in the chapel. One would accompany Tobias to the castle. One would guard Perdita. Ashcroft himself would supervise. Before they separated, Tobias pulled Perdita close, whispered against her hair. "There's no panel." "I know, but there's a tunnel, and I know where we are." She kissed him quickly. "Trust me, I'm good with maps." Then he was gone, led away at gunpoint, and Perdita was alone with a guard who looked bored and a chapel full of exits she'd been mentally cataloging since Ashcroft appeared. The guard settled against a wall, pistol loose. "Don't try anything, Your Grace." "Of course not." She sat primly on a broken pew, the picture of aristocratic helplessness, and mentally reconstructed the map. The tunnel ran from castle to chapel, roughly northeast, which meant the coast was due east, perhaps a quarter mile. The old fortifications she'd marked on her survey were nearby, with passages that connected to smugglers' routes. If she could reach them, follow the network to the harbor, she could intercept help. Matthews often checked the boats at dawn, but first she needed the guard to stop watching her. "I don't suppose," she said sweetly, "you'd permit me some privacy? Certain necessities." The guard sighed. "Behind the chapel, don't wander." She stood, moved sedately toward the chapel's rear door. Once outside, she ran. The moors stretched empty and brutal, but Perdita had mapped them. She knew the gullies, the hidden paths, the ways the land folded to conceal movement. She ran like someone conducting a survey traverse, purposeful strides, breathing controlled, mind calculating distances and bearings. Behind her, shouts. The guard had noticed, but she was already dropping into a ravine, following it east toward the coast and the fortifications and possible salvation. She emerged at the ruins 15 minutes later, lungs burning. The old fort was exactly where her map promised. Stone walls half collapsed, but the underground sections intact. She found the entrance, descended into darkness, and nearly collided with Matthews coming up. "Your Grace, what in God's name?" "No time. Baron Ashcroft. Treason. Gun. Tobias is in danger." The words came out gasped, urgent. "Need help. Now." Matthew's face went hard. How many? 3, armed, at the castle. Right. He turned, shouted down into the fortifications. Lads, we've got trouble. Men emerged, groundskeepers, stable hands, all the staff who'd served Tobias with fierce loyalty. They armed themselves with whatever was available, cudgels, tools, a few old firearms. A small army mobilized in minutes. "Show us," Matthew said. Perdita led them through the smugglers' tunnels, different from the one Tobias's father had used, but connected, part of the same network. She navigated by compass and memory, her mental map accurate enough to guide them through darkness to the castle cellars. They emerged like ghosts, spread through the castle, silent as thought. Matthew sent 2 men to find the Duke. The rest positioned themselves throughout the building. Perdita climbed to the north tower, found Ashcroft in Tobias's study, pistol trained on her husband, who stood calmly before a very solid wall claiming there was a panel that didn't exist. "I'm telling you," Tobias said with infinite patience, "the mechanism is here. You're simply not seeing it. Your wife lied. My wife is the finest cartographer in England. If she said there's a hidden panel, there's a hidden panel." Perdita stepped into the doorway. "There's not." Both men spun toward her. Ashcroft's pistol swung in her direction, and Matthews appeared behind him, cudgel connecting with the Baron's skull with a sound like a book slamming shut. Ashcroft dropped. Tobias crossed the room in 3 strides, pulled Perdita into his arms. "You're insane. Brilliant and insane. I prefer accurately informed." She was shaking now, adrenaline catching up. "I knew the smugglers' routes, just had to navigate them. You navigated a warren of unmapped tunnels in the dark to raise an army." "Mostly mapped. I've been surveying them." She pulled back to look at him. "Are you all right?" "I am now." Matthews cleared his throat. "What do we do with this one?" "Tie him up. Search him for the treason documents." Tobias kept one arm around Perdita. "Then send for the magistrate, and someone from the War Office. If Ashcroft has proof of my father's treason, we need it secured before anyone else tries to claim it." The next hours blurred. Magistrates and soldiers arrived. Ashcroft and his associates were arrested. The documents were found, exactly as he'd claimed. Proof that the old Duke had sold information to Russian agents during the war. Evidence that would have destroyed the Thornfield name. But paired with the legitimacy papers they'd found in the chapel, they told a different story. Not a bastard controlled by cruelty, but a legitimate son whose father had committed treason and then constructed an elaborate lie to keep his son dependent and silent. "It's actually better," the War Office investigator said. "We can frame it as the Duke acting alone. His son knew nothing, was actively victimized. The current Duke, you, Your Grace, are untainted. The estates remain intact." "And the coastal land?" Perdita asked. "Remains yours." Baron Ashcroft had no legitimate claim, just blackmail. The investigator gathered his papers. "You've done the Crown a service, Your Grace. Exposed a traitor, prevented further espionage. There will be honors." "I don't want honors. I want this finished." "It is, effectively immediately." The investigator bowed. "And may I say, Your Grace, both of you, you make a formidable team." After he left, Perdita and Tobias stood alone in the library where this had started, hours and lifetimes ago. "He's right," Tobias said quietly. "We do make a formidable team. Cartographer and Duke, unusual combination." "Unusual doesn't mean ineffective." He turned to face her fully. "Perdita, you saved my life today. Saved everything I've been trying to build. You..." His voice cracked. "You're extraordinary. I just used the tools I had. Maps, observation, precision. You used your brilliance to outthink an armed traitor and navigate unmapped territory in the dark. That's not just precision, that's courage." He took her hands. I know I've been difficult, closed off, but today proved something I've been suspecting for weeks. What's that? I'm in love with you. The words settled over her like snow, soft, transforming, making the whole landscape new. You're sure? Her voice came out smaller than intended. Not just grateful or relieved or... I'm sure. I've been sure since you compared me to a well-made map and kissed me in the library. He smiled. But today confirmed it. You're not just my Duchess, Perdita. You're my partner, my equal, the person I want standing beside me when everything falls apart and when it comes together. I love you. Precisely, certainly, with all the accuracy of a perfect survey. Perdita laughed, half sob, entirely joy. You're using cartography metaphors. That's how I know you mean it. I mean it. Do you... He stopped, suddenly uncertain. Do you think you might, eventually... I love you too. She said it clearly, no hesitation. I have for weeks. I just didn't know if we were allowed to, if this marriage could be that. It can be anything we make it. He kissed her then, deep, thorough, tasting of relief and promise and future mapped together. Want to help me figure out where we go from here? Always. Though I should warn you, I'm going to need access to all those smugglers' tunnels for my survey. They're geographically significant. Of course they are. His arms tightened around her. Map whatever you want, love. Just promise you'll always find your way back to me. I promise. You're my fixed point, my prime meridian. She kissed him again. Everything else is just distance and direction from here. And in the library of Thornfield Castle, surrounded by maps and documents and the evidence of both their survival and their victory, the Duke and Duchess of Thornfield began the careful work of charting their shared future, precise, honest, and entirely their own. 8 months later, September 1865. The Royal Geographical Society's publication hit London like a thunderclap. A complete survey of the Northumberland coast by P.T. Blackwood. Not a man's name. Just initials that anyone with sense could trace to Perdita Thornfield, Duchess of Thornfield, who'd spent the entire summer mapping every inlet, cliff, and coastal feature between Berwick and Newcastle with unprecedented accuracy. The reviews were mixed. Revolutionary precision, said the Times. Scandalous, said the Morning Post. Inevitable, said Tobias, reading over breakfast at their London townhouse. They'd come south for the publication, though both were already plotting their return to Northumberland. You've embarrassed every naval cartographer in England by proving their depth soundings were off by an average of 2 fathoms. 2.5, Perdita corrected absently, buttering toast. The tide tables were worse. Naturally, he folded the paper. There's going to be a dinner. The society wants to invite you, officially, as a guest speaker. First woman ever. Will you come? Are you joking? I'm not missing this. Besides, he reached across the table for her hand. I've been practicing looking impressive and ducal while my wife shows everyone how brilliant she is. I'm quite good at it now. She laughed, the sound easy and full. 8 months of actual marriage had worn away most of their sharp edges, left them comfortable in ways she'd never imagined possible. They still had separate workrooms, Tobias in his tower with the horses and veterans' correspondence, Perdita in her parlor with maps spreading like empire. But nights were spent together, and mornings, and most of the in-between moments that made life more than just survived. Speaking of brilliant, Tobias said casually, too casually, Mrs. Hodge mentioned you've been feeling unwell in the mornings. Perdita set down her toast. Observant of her. Is there something you'd like to tell me? Possibly. Probably. I've been waiting to be certain. She met his eyes. I'm pregnant, Tobias. About 3 months, the physician thinks. His face went through several expressions: shock, joy, terror, more joy. "We're having a child." "We are. A legitimate child. An entirely documented, legally verified, properly mapped child." He laughed. "Only you would describe pregnancy in surveying terms." "Well, someone has to maintain standards." She stood, moved around the table to his chair. "Are you pleased?" Terrified, ecstatic, both simultaneously. He pulled her onto his lap, a habit she'd developed of sitting on him in casual moments, seeking proximity. His hand splayed across her stomach. "A small cartographer, or horse breeder, or possibly a cartographer who breeds horses while conducting espionage. Let's hope for less espionage. One encounter with armed traitors is sufficient for a lifetime." "Agreed." He kissed her temple. "What do you want, boy or girl?" "Alive and curious. Those are my only requirements." "Mine too." They sat like that, tangled together in the breakfast room, watching London's September rain streak the windows. Outside, the city moved in its complicated patterns, people navigating between home and work, desire and duty, who they were and who they were supposed to be. Inside, a duke and a duchess who'd started as strangers and become partners, navigated toward parenthood with the tools they'd developed: honesty, precision, and the absolute certainty that they could map their way through anything as long as they did it together. "We should go back," Perdita said eventually, "to Thornfield. I want to finish the interior survey before the baby comes." "You're going to map the inside of the castle?" "Someone should. Those tunnels we discovered lead to at least 3 other locations. I've only documented 2. She twisted to look at him. "Unless you object? To my pregnant wife crawling through medieval tunnels? What could possibly concern me about that?" "I'll be careful. Matthews will accompany me. And it's historically significant. The whole network probably dates to the border wars." "Of course it does." He kissed her, thorough and claiming. "Map whatever you want, love. Just—" "I know. Come back to you. Always." She kissed him again, then stood. "Now come on. We have a geographical society to scandalize and an establishment to thoroughly upset." "My favorite activities." They dressed for the dinner in their separate rooms, then met in the hallway. Tobias in evening black that made him look like sin and salvation combined. Perdita in deep blue silk that matched her eyes and made her look like exactly what she was: a woman who'd measured the world and found it wanted. "Ready?" he asked, offering his arm. "Always." They descended to the waiting carriage. London glittered around them, wet streets reflecting gaslight like veins of gold. The city was just another map, Perdita thought, a pattern of roads and buildings and people moving in currents that could be charted if you paid attention. But unlike her coastal surveys, this map was constantly remaking itself. Every choice, every step, every decision reshaping the landscape. She'd spent her whole life trying to fix things in place, draw them accurately, preserve them in ink. But the best maps, she'd learned, were working documents. Living records that acknowledged change, incorporated new data, revised themselves when reality insisted. Their marriage was like that. Started as one thing, a transaction, a compromise. Became something else through observation and correction and the daily work of choosing each other. And now it was becoming something else again. Not just Duke and Duchess, or partners, or even lovers, but parents, a family, a new constellation to navigate by. The carriage rolled through streets she'd walked as a spinster, desperate and resigned. Past the British Museum where she'd studied borrowed maps, past her father's house. They still visited occasionally, though Frederick had fled to the continent to avoid his creditors. Past all the landmarks of who she'd been, toward the Royal Geographical Society, where she'd be introduced as P.T. Blackwood. No Duchess title, just her work speaking for itself. Toward a future she couldn't have mapped because she hadn't known such territories existed. Toward Tobias beside her, solid and certain, his hand finding hers in the dark of the carriage. "I love you," she said. Not because the moment required it, but because it was true, measurable, as accurate as any survey she'd ever conducted. "I know." He squeezed her hand. "I love you too. Now let's go show them what a cartographer can do." They arrived at the society in a burst of gaslight and gawkers. Heads turned, whispers followed. The notorious Duchess of Thornfield, who'd published under her own name, who'd done actual field work, who'd proven every previous survey of Northumberland wrong. They entered together, heads high, hands linked, and Perdita felt it. The shift, the reorientation, the sense that the world's coordinates were changing because she'd refused to accept the ones she'd been given. She'd started lost. Perdita, the lost girl, the unwanted daughter, the inconvenient blue stocking. But she'd found her way by the oldest method humans knew: careful observation, precise measurement, and the courage to trust her instruments even when everyone said she was reading them wrong. And now she stood at the center of London's geographical establishment, carrying a child and a reputation and a survey that would be cited for the next 100 years. Not lost, found. Exactly, precisely, cartographically found. The dinner began. Perdita spoke about methodology and triangulation and the importance of field verification. And somewhere in the middle of explaining how she'd corrected the tidal measurements, she caught Tobias's eye across the room. He smiled, that rare, unguarded smile that said, "I see you, all of you, and you're exactly where you're supposed to be." She smiled back and continued her presentation, and knew with absolute certainty that they'd mapped the rest of their lives together, correcting errors, discovering new territories, always finding their way home to each other. Because that's what love was in the end. Not a fixed point, but a shared direction. Not a destination, but a journey measured in daily observations, small corrections, and the persistent work of choosing the same person over and over until choosing became as natural as breathing. She finished her talk to applause. Tobias stood in the back, clapping harder than anyone, looking at her like she'd hung stars instead of just documenting coastlines. And Perdita thought, This is the life I charted when I agreed to marry a scarred duke I'd never seen. Except he wasn't scarred, and I'd never seen him, and nothing was what I expected. But it was exactly what I needed. Precisely, cartographically, perfectly right.